Yeah, happy to do it.
Well, listen, let's just jump right into it here because I just this is like not just a couple of hours ago, maybe even not that far. Hegseth was in front of a congressional testimony, and he was talking about in this first clip we're going to see here about the justification for why we had to go to war. And he's going to make a mistake that the president has also made recently, and that he actually undermines his whole justification. Okay, those are radically different justifications. One is I saw them at a weakest moment here and I took action to try to knock them out. And the other one is that there is an imminent threat. Imminent threat is what everybody, to include the president, claimed was absolutely forced his hand. But now then here's Hegseth saying this imminent threat of 2 weeks to a nuclear weapon was physically impossible because allegedly it's buried under tons of rubble in the mountains. What say you?
I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is much better at making these points. And that's not surprising since these are Netanyahu's talking points. I'm afraid that Hegseth has probably gotten a little tongue-tied here and worked himself into a corner. He should have stuck with the basic lie that's been told from the beginning, that Iran was building a nuclear weapon and continues to do so. Instead, he's made the mistake of essentially echoing President Trump's comments that the nuclear capability was buried and therefore no longer exists. You can't make this stuff up. These people want it every way and sideways and as deep as possible. Now they can't get out of the hole they've dug for themselves.
And, the other part there of his comments is that, if it wasn't an imminent threat, they haven't given up on their ambitions. He said, you're missing the point. They haven't given up on their ambitions. So far, the only thing I have seen in our classified and released intelligence assessments plus anything public is that Iran, prior to 28 February, had categorically said that they were not going to a nuclear weapon. Our intelligence said they weren't. So upon what basis, if you've ever heard anywhere else, because I haven't, does he make the claim that they haven't given up on their ambitions? Other than his statement, have you seen any evidence to support that?
No, but once again, that's a talking point from Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he seems to be calling the tune to which everybody is dancing. I think we can also say with absolute certainty that everyone watching this atrocity unfold in front of us has concluded that if you don't want to be attacked by the United States or Israel or both, you really need a nuclear weapon. So I'm surprised nobody at the hearing brought that up. That if you really are judging this from a very objective standpoint, then I think Mr. Hegseth and President Trump are both ensuring that in the future, nuclear weapons will proliferate.
And obviously, that's not quite the expectation or the outcome we were seeking here. What do you think was the intent? Let's just go back to the ultimate purpose of this war. I know you have for decades talked about, you want to have an objective, you want to have an end state, you want to have the means to get it done, and you have a whole plan before you launch and take one period of action. It's pretty clear that none of that happened, but as best you can ascertain, what was the intent? What was the end state that President Trump and this whole cohort wanted to see on the other side? What do you think they tried to accomplish?
I think the objective was, from the very beginning, to bring Iran to a point where it is willing to subjugate or subordinate itself to Israel's demands, that Iran would reach a point where they understand it is best to essentially neutralize yourself, go along with whatever Israel wants, because if you do that, you'll be left alone, at least insofar as the Israelis are concerned. And I think that purpose has failed miserably. I think with each successive attack, Iran has become more and more convinced that it must fight to the bitter end because it's essentially the last man standing in the region. I think the Iranians continue to communicate with the Turks and the Egyptians, two potentially powerful states who could intervene in this conflict and bring it to a rapid close. But neither are willing to do that because neither of them want to go to war with us. But I think the region is reaching a point where they've begun to understand that we are the arm of Israel and that we're going to continue to do whatever it is that Israel wants, regardless of the consequences. So when you go through your purpose, method, end state, the purpose was, what did it start? We're going to bomb in support of an uprising. That failed. Purpose number two, we're going to decapitate the regime. We're going to topple the regime. We're going to replace the regime. That failed. Number three, having failed to replace the regime, well, then we're going to utterly destroy the Iranian state and nation. Well, that didn't work. We ran out of munitions, and the Iranians demonstrated that they could effectively nullify our influence. So now we're at a different set of crossroads. We still are insisting that Iran must agree to Israel's terms, but we've said those terms are largely about a nuclear weapon. And again, the Iranians had, as you point out, said they don't want a nuclear weapon. My point is now I think if you're an Iranian, particularly under the age of 30 or under the age of 40, you're beginning to conclude that you absolutely must have a nuclear weapon. So I think we've now radicalized the youth, the younger generation of Iranians, to the point where they're going to fight tooth and nail forever. And I think the other problem that we've got is that nobody believes anything we say. How many times can you change your argument? How many times can you alter the theme and then come back and expect somebody to believe anything that you commit to? I think that's the other problem.
Well, you know what? That's an important point that's not getting as much notice. Or obviously, people are still right now trying to focus on, are we going to restart the war or not, and how are we going to get out of this mess? But there are other things, kind of a canary in the coal mine, like your view deal. But I can't imagine that it's detached or divorced from what's happening here, because one wonders, are they starting to say, hey, we can't count on you at all. We better start figuring out for ourselves. What do you make of that?
The Koreans have wanted operational command and control of their own armed forces for many years now. Right now, the Korean armed forces are under the command of an Army 4-star, who is the commander of U.S. Forces Korea. He is also the combined joint UN commander that disposes over the Koreans as well as over American forces. They want to get out of that. Now, we can talk about why. Well, first of all, Korea is now an immensely powerful state. They have approaching 40 to 50 million people. They have a tremendous scientific industrial base. It's increasingly clear that North Korea is not going to attack, because North Korea is being told by both Moscow and Beijing not to do that. The Koreans are doing a land office business with China. They see, and so do the Japanese, by the way, the hostilities emerging between us and China. Neither Korea nor Japan want to be dragged into a war against China. Now, you put all of that together, and they are being as polite as possible, but they're privately telling us to get the hell out of Korea. We should. We've been there for 70 years. There's no requirement for us to be there anymore. There hasn't been for a long time. They can defend themselves. And most of all, they want peace in Asia, which, by the way, is what everybody else in Asia wants. We're the ones that keep talking about war in Asia, not the Chinese, not the Koreans, and not the Japanese. So I think this is more evidence of our imperial overstretch that's worn out its welcome. And the vassal states that have lived within this framework want out from under us. And that includes Korea. And I think you'll soon see the same thing happen in Japan.
Well, that would certainly be a tectonic shift. It seems likely that a lot of this has been at least ooched on and accelerated, perhaps, because of the demonstrated, let's just say it, incompetence in how we, number one, chose to wage this war, and now how we're actually conducting it. How do you see it?
Well, it's not just incompetence. It's viewing the current president and, frankly, the government as a whole, because Congress, as we know, just from the recent voting that's gone on about the War Powers Act and so forth, Congress is actively supporting the president. So if you're sitting in Korea or Japan, you're sitting almost anywhere in Asia, you like to do business with us. You don't dislike us. You want to be on good terms with us, but you see us as kind of this rogue power, this dangerous, contagious patient that has to be kept down at the end of the hall in the hospital. The guys in the white coats are waiting to take us away, as far as the Asians are concerned, because they don't see the justification or the rationale or the need for conflict, period. We are the ones that have created the conflicted region of the Middle East and created and potentially could create similar conflict in Asia. So I think people have had it with us, and I'm surprised that more of this has not happened sooner. But people in Asia are nothing if not patient, and they all desperately want to be polite. But this is all going to fall apart on Donald Trump's watch.
Yeah, and that could be starting, as you said, there in the South Korea. I want to go back to Secretary Hegseth, though, because one would think logically that having seen that 40 days and 40 nights of bombing did not budge any of our objectives at all, any of them. You rattled off several of the changing objectives, and none of those have been accomplished. So you would think, all right, now we need to find a way to get out of here because this ain't working. And to turn it back on would just produce more of the same, except drain other portions of our inventory. So that's bad, because then that would diminish our defensive capabilities elsewhere in the world. But there is a theme rolling around here, Doug, to where people are saying, and I'm talking supporters of the president, no, man, you just haven't pushed hard enough yet. Don't get weak-kneed on me and quit now. Watch this exchange between Hegseth and a friendly. Wow, it's extraordinary. I thought it was an abject strategic failure, but apparently I've missed the boat. What do you think?
Well, I think the gentleman forgets that the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor. And that precipitated the mobilization of the United States for war. Iran has not attacked us. It has not attacked our CONUS or continental-based forces. It hasn't attacked us at Pearl Harbor. It hasn't attacked us in Korea or Japan. It is not attacking us, or has not been attacking us, in the Middle East. Now you listen to people and say, well, that's not true. Those Iranians, they were pushing those Iraqis, and look at what happened to us. Well, I've got news for you. We supported Saddam Hussein and Iraq and the Iraqi armed forces in its war with Iran. And Saddam Hussein and his Iraqi forces killed some 800,000 people on the Iranian side. And we not only supplied them with weapons and equipment and training and advice, we actually encouraged Saddam Hussein to use chemical weapons against Iran. So this is the way the real world views us. This is the way the Iranians are viewing us. So I think that particular politician, I don't know what his name is living on another planet. He's certainly not on planet Earth, and he doesn't understand what's at risk here or what's at stake, because we're moving away from simply trying to beat Iran into submission because of what Israel wants, to a setting that could ultimately accelerate our descent into a regional war that could become global. Nobody seems to get that. But then again, we kind of live on planet America.
Yeah, which just creates out of pure cloth fiction whatever it wants to believe, and then they'll just pretend like it is true. And we're running into the reality how that is now going to crash the spin into rubble. Let's take a look at what we're trying to do now. So one thing that has been recognized in the White House is that this hasn't been working. So now that President Trump is faced, and according to leaks that have come out in just the last 12 hours, so quite a few last night, one is that we should extend the blockade and just go it longer. Another one is that we should just declare victory and walk away. And then a third one is, no, we need to double down on the military. And there are advocates for each one of those. I want to take a look at the one that seems to be, earlier today anyway, seemed to be getting on the ascendancy in the White House, according to Axios. And I'll tell you in just a second that now, since this time, it seems like he's shifting back toward the worst of the outcome, which is to try more. Here is this is what he posted. This is what they were referring to, this very bizarre post from this morning, that Iran can't get their act together. They don't know how to sign a non-nuclear deal. Doug, what do you make of these three options and his actions here?
Well, I think it's disappointing that the President of the United States presents his views and opinions in the form of a comic strip, because that's effectively what we're looking at. This is a very superficial glance at something which is equally superficial, and that is Trump's approach to this entire matter. There's no maturity, there's no balance, there's no real diplomacy, there's no serious thinking about the strategic implications for us, let alone the rest of the world. And the rest of the world right now is really very, very close to walking away from us completely. So let's stop and look at these three options. Let's start with the last one, declare victory and walk away. Well, fine, declare victory. The only people that are going to take that seriously are people probably in the White House. Now, the good news is that most Americans are not interested in this. They don't support the war. So, frankly, from his standpoint, ending this conflict is an easy win for Donald Trump. He would be applauded for doing so. But we have the third party. It's called Israel. That's unacceptable. So, scrap declaring victory and walking away. 2, blockade. How effective is the blockade? Well, it's very effective right now insofar as going to breed famine all over the global south. It's reducing Europe to ruins. It's creating conditions all over the world conducive to panic and destruction. Why? Because there are 47 different types of petroleum products that can't get out of the Persian Gulf. He's not really hurting Iran. Iran will stay the course. There is no evidence that Iran is going to wake up tomorrow morning and say, please, please don't harm us anymore. The exact opposite is the case. We have a increasingly radicalized population, particularly under the age of 40, that wants no more discussion and no more negotiations with us under any circumstances. So the blockade is going to have do more damage to us as a country and ultimately more damage to the rest of the world than it's going to harm Iran. In fact, Iran will probably come out of this looking like a superhero compared to us, given where we're headed. Now, that leads us to the last option, which is go back, repeat what you did before with more violence, more munitions, more forces. Will that work? I doubt it very seriously, but I think that's what he considers to be probably his best option. He's put everything on the line. His presidency right now is on the line. His survival in office is on the line. If he took option 3, I think he could survive. Option 2 will not keep him there. Will option 1 keep him in office? Well, he may think so, because he may say, I may get lucky. The problem with the first option is the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, everybody around the world that's watching this, everybody in Europe is sort of suspending disbelief that we would be this barbarous and this stupid to put everything on the line for a war against a country that threatens none of them. So I think he'll go for option 1, because I don't think he gives a damn what happens around the world. I don't think he gives a damn about anything or anybody else. So I think you're going to get option 1. Hope I'm wrong. To support the population we have today. And if you look at that, nothing is coming out of the Gulf. And neither the Russians nor we nor anybody else can produce enough to export and help others. In fact, there was a letter sent to the President of the United States that was signed by leaders in the agricultural arena. They were talking about farmers right now, bankruptcy among farmers after the failure of this first operation, and say, look, on humanitarian grounds, as the President of the United States, and he styles himself the leader of the free world, although I think that falls on deaf ears now, I am going to suspend this operation because it's in the interest of the world to stop. Well, he's not going to do that. And so he's throwing our farmers under the bus. He's throwing the American population standard of living under the bus. He's throwing much of the world under the bus. He doesn't seem to care.
Now, let me ask you another question, Doug. I know something that is kind of left a pretty sour taste in your mouth about something that was in the Washington Post last week by Mark Thiessen. To what extent do you think that this plays into that theme of the diminishing credibility? But we've had the fact that we started this war. We had the fact that we killed these kids on day one. We assassinated their leader. Now then there's problems with the price of oil, and it's affecting our allies in Asia, Europe, and Africa already. And now that we're trying to potentially take a step that could go further and harm literally everyone if we go back to the kinetic phase here because of the Iranian response. What is this doing to our future as a nation, almost no matter how this works out? Has this, or do you think we're in the process of changing how the rest of the world sees us from what used to be the city on a hill that we were supposed to be an example for people to follow to something that everyone should fear or even hate?
I think we've gone from the city on the hill to a leper colony. And I think we're going to remain in that condition for some time. especially if he presses ahead and unleashes hell one more time on Iran. International sympathy is not with us. I know he's not concerned about that. He's worried about his donors, who are preeminently concerned about Israel, not us. So I don't think it's going to make any difference what you and I say here today. But the truth is, we're being transformed into a leper colony. Nobody's going to want to do business with us under any circumstances. And we've always taken a position that everybody has to do business with us. That's not true. They can do business with alternative sources. What are those alternative sources? Well, lots of them are in Asia. That's particularly true for China and Japan and Korea and Taiwan, and for Southeast Asia. And increasingly, the Europeans are viewing us as certifiably insane. They haven't figured out what we're trying to do because it doesn't make any difference to them from the standpoint of whom we hate or dislike. But when you disrupt the global supply chain and you destroy the energy complex, everybody says, well, wait a minute. These are the people that destroyed Nord Stream 2. You know, what are we doing with them? These are not allies. These people are sick. They're dangerous. They're demented. They're deranged. I think we're losing our standing all over the world. And, you know, we can always take something of a beating just because we're a leading power. But this makes no sense. This borders on criminality. I think the American people in another 2 or 3 months are going to be in the streets in this country. And I think they're going to demand an accounting. And I think the people in Washington are incredibly stupid to ignore that reality, because the things we are doing to others are going to go into a state of scarcity. In other words, we're going to replace the abundance that we've become accustomed to, that we like and take for granted. It's going to become scarcity. People are not going to be able to buy the things that they're accustomed to buying. They're not going to be able to go where they want to go. I don't think the people in Washington understand this. I think they're living in a fantasy world because they're living in the world where you can print money. Well, you can print money, but you can't print petroleum.
Hasten that on is if we return to combat operations, because Iran has definitely promised that if there is any attack at all, if it's resumed, no matter, even if we try the so-called small version, they again won't recognize the scale of it, only the fact of it, and that they said they will immediately strike back and hit energy sources throughout the Gulf, et cetera. And now that you don't have a political block, you have a physical block of supply. It can't be turned back on for maybe close to a year, something probably not till next year at the earliest once the war is over. So that's the worst possible outcome.
Well, actually, let's stop a minute because it's worse than that. Most of the analysts that are familiar with the oil markets, and they understand, and a lot of time to refit and rework the oil infrastructure and make it productive. Remember, the corporate heads of the oil sector met with President Trump about Venezuela, and they tried to explain to him how much money it would take and how long it would take to recover Venezuela from the state of decay that its oil infrastructure finds itself. We're now going to face that. Now, if we go back in now and do exactly what you've said, we'll probably attack many of the same targets. We'll no doubt find new ones. I also think we're going to find a much more resilient, robust, and capable Iran than we faced the first and second time. But then we're going to do that.
Gary just had a headline up there a minute ago of what Besson's calling Operation Economic Fury, where they have now again caused problems with the devaluing the currency in Iran. So they're continuing to do that while there's other things are going on as well. The blockade issue is the real. Yeah, I can just, if I need to go another couple of months, which is one of the timeframes I've heard floated, the Iranian side may not just go along with that, and they may themselves start to do something to either our ships or the blockade or something else, or trying to run it, et cetera. So even that could spark a return. How concerned are you about that?
I would go a step further, and I would point out that if the tankers, when they're finally allowed to leave the Persian Gulf, if we stop them in the Strait of Malacca, or we interrupt their journey to deliver their products to China, Korea, Japan, and so forth, we could very easily find ourselves at war with China. And I don't think people are taking that seriously right now. And the Chinese are much better prepared for that than we are. They have built a lot of nuclear power plants. They built a lot of coal-fired plants. They have stockpiled a lot of energy. They're ready, if they have to fight us. They have built an enormous fleet. I don't think it's as good as ours by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a lot of it. And they have the capability to do what Iran has been doing to us. And I would say that capability would be on steroids. And that's the ability to reach out and essentially destroy an entire surface fleet from a distance, not just the surface fleet, but any islands where we put anything. So I think we're courting disaster at this stage. And then the real question is, if China becomes involved, what will the Russians do? I suspect that they'll take the gloves off. They'll finish off things in Ukraine, and they'll turn with the Chinese against us. And I don't think they'll be the only ones. I don't think the Indians are going to sit there and do nothing, because India faces famine. India faces huge shortages. For these governments in Asia to do nothing and let us continue indefinitely is the pathway to suicide for them. Not only will their governments be replaced, but their populations are going to suffer. So I think it's worse than what you've said. It's not just Iran. It suddenly involves everyone else. And I think we got to go back to the region, and who else could become involved at this stage? Who else is on the line for all of this? Egypt, the largest Arab state in the region, and Turkey. And Turkey, of course, is probably the most powerful single military state in NATO. And there's nothing that we've seen hurled at us from Iran that the Turks don't also have. And no doubt in my mind, the Russians would certainly support and stand by the Turks and Egypt. So, this is running out of control. And people like Thiessen and others who are urging mass murder on the basis of arrogance and ignorance, they should be shouted down, because we don't need that. We don't want that. And that could be the end of us. You could see the complete collapse of American national power. We're already on the edge of serious trouble, but that would be the end of us.
Dan, bring yourself in.
Sorry about that. It's one thing, Doug, if it's a Washington Post reporter, because he's the guy that just writes an article, right? Apparently President Trump listens to him. But it's even more concerning when there are guys who we know have President Trump's ear and that he listens to. Let me show you what Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to tell Trump. We don't even have to ask that question. But when you see guys like Thiessen saying what it was in that Washington Post article, you know what Lindsey Graham is saying too. And then here's Jack Keane, a 4-star general, retired straight out of casting, central casting, as Trump says a lot of times. When all of those voices are saying a version of what he said here, it's going to be pretty hard for him to resist that, don't you think?
Well, he tends to be influenced by the people that have access to him. Not everybody has access. And we have a lot of evidence, as we've seen recently from the article in the Atlantic, not that the Atlantic is the paragon of truthfulness and objectivity, but we did learn a great deal about Vice President Vance's personal thoughts and his concern that President Trump is not getting a full picture. We've had lots of people spin out fantasies about General Kane and how he is the adult in the room and all this kind of business. There's not much evidence for that. I think it's very dangerous. I don't disagree with you at all. Imagine if you had 20, 30 million people under the age of 40, all of whom want blood, who have decided that we can't be trusted, we don't want to negotiate, and are willing to fight to the bitter end and do whatever is required to be victorious. That's a terrible situation to be in. It's the last thing you want. This is back to this absurd idea of unconditional surrender. And that's effectively what Keane and Lindsey Graham and Thiessen and the rest of these neocons, all of whom are closely aligned to and in support of Mr. Netanyahu, want. They want unconditional surrender, just as Israel wants the total destruction of Iran. None of those things are in the interest of the American people. That's the problem. We're not interested in that. We don't want that. And then to compare this to the outbreak of World War II and the way people in the United States felt after the Japanese attacked us without warning on a Sunday morning at a time when Americans had very different sets of values from the ones we're accustomed to today is absurd. And this other thing about they don't share our values and concerns. They don't care about their population. I couldn't disagree more. I think they care very much about the population. My concern is that if you're successful, you kill everybody that you are currently dealing with. The people that will step into their shoes, They will fight to the end. They will go down as martyrs before they ever go down on their knees to Israel, let alone us.
Yeah, that's such a great point there, because that is their proclivity of a substantial portion of the population. And we're seeing it play out. They're actually living that right now. Well, listen, Doug, in the amount of time we have left, I want to shift gears to something we haven't talked about in a while, but there are things happening there too, which have an impact on us here. In addition to all this stuff that we're talking about with the Iran war, there's still the Russia-Ukraine war going on. And kind of underneath the headlines, there's been a couple of important things that have happened I want to bring to your attention, or to our audience's attention, and get your view on. Number one is the European Union has, first of all, they've started another sanctions package on Russia. I think it's the 20th, and they're trying to get yet another 21st. I guess they just don't ever learn that hasn't changed anything, but they're going to keep trying. Then they also approved, because Viktor Orban was defeated, a $90 billion loan package to Ukraine, which Ursula von der Leyen here, financial perspective, already, because of our actions in the Persian Gulf here, everybody's oil prices is going up. Russia is potentially going to shut off what they had in Kazakhstan to make it even more problematic. Where are they going to get this money from?
Well, that's a good question. I'm sure they'll find a way to print some. I mean, that's all I can say. Whether or not it's going to be worth much is open to debate, especially if things go in the direction I think they're going to go here in the United States in the near future. And all you have to do is turn on Ray Dalio. Even Jamie Dimon finally is admitting that the bond market is in great risk right now of essentially catching fire, in the sense that you end up with yields that are just impossible to ever pay. And all these things are coming. But let's keep something in mind. Von der Leyen was the Secretary or Minister of Defense in Germany. And one of her great contributions was to tell the manufacturers of armored fighting vehicles that they had to adapt seating inside armored fighting vehicles. We're talking about Martyrs, we're talking about Pumas, we're talking about various kinds of equipment to accommodate pregnant German women so that they could ride into battle. The last thing I would want if I had a daughter and she were pregnant was to stick her in an armored fighting vehicle and send her into combat. But this is the level of craziness. And on top of that, von der Leyen is from the state of Germany that is being systematically deindustrialized, all because of the hate fest that she and others have helped to start against Russia. And unfortunately, Europe is a place with long memories, and people can be convinced of things that aren't true based on what happened 80, 85 years ago. Trying to tell someone that the Russians today have nothing to do with the Soviet troops that raped millions of women and killed millions of people on their way into Europe doesn't really register with a lot of people that don't understand the difference, don't understand how profoundly different Russia is today. So they are the Pied Pipers leading this entire population straight into hell. The Germans are going to have to wake up. Now, the good news is that the Alternative for Germany has now scored enormous success at the ballot box, and they won 28% of the vote. Now, people in the United States say, well, that's not much. No. You have to understand, when you look at the multiplicity of parties and the percentages that others have, the Alternative for Germany, by any normal standard, should have a role in governing Germany. And of course, von der Leyen and her friends are going to throw themselves onto in front of the on-rushing locomotive to stop that if necessary, because, God forbid, the Alternative for Germany would throw out most of the migrants that have come into Germany since 2015 under Merkel. And that's something that is desperately needed, not just in Germany, but across Europe. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But if the Alternative for Germany is barred from any future government, I don't think Germany is going to last too much longer as a true republic. There will be uprisings in Germany. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that President Putin has exercised as much restraint as he has, because he would prefer that the Europeans conclude that he really is not the enemy. But the only way for that to happen is to remove these globalists, these anti-nationalists, these internationalists who want to destroy Europe from power. And that hasn't happened yet, but I think we're getting closer. That's the good news.
Well, yeah, we'll see how that goes. But let's look at the other half of that equation there with this $90 billion loan. Will that matter to Ukraine? Is that going to either sustain them so they can keep fighting and have some, I don't know, hope that somehow things can turn around in the future? Will this help it turn around? These drones she's talking about? Will there be any chance that this could alter the balance of power between Russia and Ukraine?
No, but we have to reckon that 50% of this will end up in offshore accounts belonging to Zelensky and everybody else in his government, including many people in parliament, many of his senior officers and diplomats, all of whom have been stealing everything they could get their hands on. So that's the first thing. So what happens to the rest of it? The other 45 billion, will some of that trickle into the defense of the country? Yeah, probably. But is it really going to change anything? Well, they'll certainly get more assistance with drones, and drones have done a lot of damage. And that's the rub right now. The Ukrainians were able to launch a drone that they were helped to build, by the way. They do not build everything on their own. They don't create all the components on their own. Those components come from places like Great Britain and Germany and Italy and other countries, and they assemble them. And they were able to launch one roughly 1,000 plus miles all the way to the northern part of the Caspian Sea. These kinds of things have infuriated the Russian population. So just as we've succeeded in radicalizing the Iranians and the youth of Iran, I think the Ukrainians don't realize the extent to which people in Russia really want Putin to extract more than just a pound of flesh. They want him to go forward and flatten Ukraine. I don't think Putin will do that right. It's being pointed out to him that the quickest way to put an end to this disaster called Ukraine is to seize Odessa. That would cut it off. It would become landlocked, entirely dependent upon what comes to it through Poland. And I think that could happen. And that would be the first step in the final dissolution of Ukraine and the end of this war. Because after you seize Odessa, it's not very difficult to seize Kiev. And I think more and more Russians are coming to the conclusion that they're going to have to do that, because this regime must be destroyed or there will be no peace, period, in Europe.
And that's certainly the view of many on the Russian side, and the opposite view of those on the European side, because they still have these fantasies that something is going to change. One of those that has a fantasy is the King of Britain, who was in the United States to give a speech before the U.S. Congress. Now, notice how the subject of Ukraine comes up in this big applause line. And just so he's still, I don't know if he's been listening to Keir Starmer, because that's almost that's his go-to statement. Thus, just and lasting peace. Are they disconnected from reality?
Absolutely, completely. And I think that we may, unless King Charles III leaves office in the near future, I think you could actually see the end of his dynasty. That's the sad part. I think Britain is now in need of dynastic change. Now, you said it sounded like Keir Starmer. I'm sure that's true. Keir Starmer's approval ratings are where? In the low 30s. I think the King's approval ratings are probably down there with him. I haven't looked at them lately. He's not taken seriously at all, whereas his mother was held in very high esteem, commanded tremendous respect. He does not. Now, hopefully, that could all change with the ascent of William to the throne. I don't know. But the bottom line is this is pure nonsense. But what's disturbing is that you saw all the usual suspects, Democrats and Republicans, all stand up and cheer on this stupidity. If they're not careful, they will ultimately succeed in getting what they want. And they seem to want a world war in which they want to fight everyone. And they may succeed because increasingly everyone wants to fight us. And by the way, with all due respect, Britain lost everything the last time it fought with us. It lost its national power. It lost its empire. Britain adds almost zero to our capabilities and our forces. And that's sad, because that was not the case 80 years ago. But at this point, I wouldn't expect very much support from anybody if the kind of world war develops that I think is possible now. All of this hinges on some decisions by President Trump, just as whether or not the world went to war in 1914 really hinged on the decisions that were made by the Tsar of Russia. People will recall that the Tsar of Russia decided to mobilize his country in support of Serbia against Austria. That brought on the First World War. It wasn't necessary. Serbia was not a vital strategic interest to Russia, and the Russians could have talked directly with the Austrians and said, let's iron this out some other way, and made it very clear that under no circumstances did the Russians want to go to war with anybody. But he did the opposite because he at the time was surrounded by warmongering voices telling him that this was his path to greatness. We know now it was his path to destruction.
And death for him.
Yes, and Russia has only recently recovered thanks to Putin, the man that everybody here wants to hate.
Indeed. And in fact, speaking of him, you mentioned a while ago the Ukraine side is getting better at its long-range drones. They've been striking some in the Ekaterinburg and several other places on the Black Sea coast that's hitting a lot of oil infrastructure, which is also starting to cause a lot of angst and anger inside of Russia. President Putin for Oblast into the Russian by allowing them to vote for Duma deputies for the first time. What do you make of that?
Well, these people are Russians. And he wants them to vote. He wants them to have a say in their future and their destiny. So I think that makes infinite sense. This was always from the very beginning about the treatment of Russians in Ukraine. Russians in Ukraine were reduced to second and third class citizenship. Their rights were violated. They were mistreated. They were being forced to, quote unquote, Ukrainianize or lose everything. And ultimately, that's why the Russians intervened. The war that ensued really ensues because of us. We encouraged it. Remember that the initial negotiations in Istanbul would have produced an end to the war. And that's when we sent the clown in chief from Great Britain, Boris Yeltsin, and he walked
Boris
in.
Johnson.
Excuse me, Boris Yeltsin. Yeah, Boris Johnson.
Although I can see where you can get them confused.
Yeah, there are certain clown-like tendencies on both sides, but he walked in and said, absolutely not. You'll have the whole might and power of NATO behind you. We want you to fight. And so he said, okay. And he's been doing it ever since and richly rewarded for it. But his country's destroyed. They're down to between 18 and 20 million people in Ukraine. That's all that's left. Most Ukrainians that have left and gone to Europe or elsewhere in the world have no intentions of ever coming back to Ukraine. Ukraine is a dead state for all intents and purposes. Now, Putin did not set out to create that. That was created by the leadership of the West when we decided to make Ukraine our proxy to fight Russia. We ought to stop. And I thought, as so many other people did when I voted for President Trump, and where originally I was supporting RFK Jr., I know what he would have done, but I did hope that President Trump would walk away from this. But I want to leave everybody with this picture in their minds. We have a president that communicates with us through a comic strip that he creates in the middle of the night when he sends out a quote unquote rage tweet or something like it, perhaps while he is, as Joe Rogan said, spray tanning himself. This is not only unprecedented straightforwardness and honesty to his population. That's why he has support. That's why people believe in him. But he's also careful about what he says. And he doesn't threaten anything that he does not deliver on. And he prefers not to threaten at all. I wish that were the case for the president that we have right now. It isn't. And I think it's dangerous. And if something is not done shortly, and he goes ahead and expands this war by bombing and striking Iran for another several days or weeks, I think we're going to face a new world, and we're not going to like it very much because we're the leper in that world that nobody will want to deal with. And it could easily lead ultimately into a war where everyone decides the only way to stop the maniacs in Washington is to organize and fight them.
And God help us all if that day ever arrives, because not only would that be catastrophic, we don't even have a military that can handle that anymore because, well, I don't need to go into all that. But we always appreciate you coming on and telling us the truth and telling us where we are. So God willing that somebody's paying attention to this in the White House, i.e. President Trump, ultimately, to realize it is suicidal to his own interest, not merely the country's, but his own, if that's all he cares about. Even then, he should take this action and get this thing off before it's too late. We just have to hope that that's the case because you've laid out a path for him to do that. Thank you so much for coming on.
Right. Thank you, Dan.